Notification came through at 2047 in the afternoon, and I had to read it 3 times before it sank in. Senior financial analyst, promotion effective, immediately. I was standing in the hallway outside the conference room at Meridian Capital, still holding the folder I brought in for what I thought was a routine quarterly review. My manager, Denise, had closed the door, poured 2 cups of coffee from the credenza in the corner, and told me to sit down. She said the partners had been watching my portfolio risk models for the past 18 months. She said my restructuring proposal for the Henderson account had saved the firm close to $400,000 in exposure. She slid a single sheet of paper across the table with the new title and the new salary printed in clean black type, and she shook my hand like I was already someone different. I walked to my car in the parking garage and just sat there for a minute. 31 years old. 6 years of working through lunch, of studying for the CFA while my husband watched TV in the next room, of staying late on Friday nights when everyone else had already gone home. 6 years of that, and here it was. Senior financial analyst at one of the most respected mid-size investment firms in Dallas. I texted my husband from the driver's seat. Just got promoted. Call me when you can. He didn't call. He sent back a thumbs-up emoji. I told myself he was busy. He had a habit of leaving his phone on the kitchen counter when he was in the garage working on his car, and probably hadn't really seen it yet. I drove home with the radio off, rehearsing how I'd tell him the details. The 32% salary increase, the new office on the 4th floor, the fact that Denise had mentioned I'd be leading my own team by Q2. I pictured him putting down whatever he was doing and actually listening, asking questions, maybe pulling me into one of those bear hugs that used to feel like safety. Our house was the kind of house we'd bought together 6 years ago when everything still felt like it was moving in the same direction. A 4-bedroom colonial in Frisco, which we'd bought with the understanding that someday the extra rooms would be used. We talked about kids. We talked about a lot of things. When I walked through the front door, the TV in the living room was on full volume. He was on the couch, one arm slung over the back cushion, watching some car restoration show he'd seen at least 3 times. "Hey," I said, "did you see my text?" He glanced over. "Yeah, congrats." He turned back to the screen. I stood in the entryway still holding my work bag. Something in my chest went flat and still, the way water goes flat after you drop a stone in it and the ripples finally stop. "Can you turn that down for a second?" He exhaled the way you do when someone asks you to do something you find unreasonable, but he pointed the remote at the TV and hit the mute button without looking at me. I walked into the living room. I sat in the chair across from him. I told him about the meeting, about Denise, about the salary. I laid it out the way I'd practiced it in the car, trying to keep the eagerness out of my voice because I didn't want to seem like I was asking him to be proud of me. I wasn't asking, I was telling him good news. "That's all." He nodded a few times. He said, "That's good timing, actually." He said it like something he'd been waiting to say. I looked at him. "What do you mean?" He sat up straighter and set the remote down on the cushion beside him. He had an expression I recognized from the times he'd talked me into things I hadn't agreed to. There was a version of gentleness on his face that wasn't really gentleness. "My dad called this morning," he said. "The plant in Odessa is closing. They're letting everyone go." I felt the cold start somewhere in my sternum. I didn't say anything. I waited. He doesn't have a lot saved up. You know how he is. And with his back the way it's been, he can't just walk into another labor job. He's going to need somewhere to land for a while. My brother's already got 2 kids in a 2-bedroom, so that's out. I kept my voice neutral. "Okay, what are you saying?" "My dad's going to stay with us for a while." He said it simply, the way you'd say it's raining outside. Maybe 6 months, maybe a little longer, depending. I thought of my father-in-law, a man who had never once, in the 8 years I'd known him, asked how my job was going. A man who called me the wife when he introduced me to people, as if my name were a minor detail. A man who had borrowed $3,000 from us 3 years ago to fix his truck and had never mentioned paying it back. 6 months, I said, give or take. He shrugged. And he mentioned maybe Terence comes too, just for the first month or so, while he figures out his next move. Terence was his younger brother. 26, never held a job for longer than 4 months, spent most of his time asking people for money in ways that were framed as investments. "So your dad and your brother," I said, "both of them." Moving in. It's family, he said. The tone he used was the one that was supposed to make me feel like any other answer would be selfish. We've got the room. It doesn't make sense for them to struggle when we've got two empty bedrooms sitting there. One of those bedrooms is my home office, I said. I work from home 2 days a week. You know that. You can set up in the dining room. It's fine. He'd already thought through where I would go. He'd already rearranged the house in his head before he'd said a word to me. When is this happening? I asked. He's driving up this weekend. Terence is coming with him. This weekend. 4 days. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't throw anything. I sat in that chair and looked at my husband, this man I built a life with, and I said, "You made this decision without asking me. I knew you'd make it into a whole thing," he said. "And honestly, with your promotion and everything, the timing's actually good. You can cover more of the expenses for a while." "Your timing is good," I thought. He'd waited. He'd waited for this exact moment, for the salary bump that hadn't even gone into effect yet, to move two people into my house and reassign my income to cover them. "What about my office?" I asked. "What about the space we talked about using? Don't start with the baby stuff again." He cut me off. The edge in his voice was sudden and sharp. "We're not doing that conversation right now." I stood up. I told him I was going to bed. He didn't follow. I lay on my side of the bed in the dark and looked at the ceiling. The baby stuff. That was what 6 years of us talking about our future had become. The baby stuff. The thing we were not doing right now. The room that was now being converted without a conversation. The plans that apparently belonged to me and no one else. I thought about the money. I pulled my phone out and opened our joint banking app and looked at the savings account. We had been putting $500 a month into it for 2 years. It was supposed to be a safety net, a foundation. There was a transfer from 9 days ago I hadn't noticed, $2,000, sent to an account I didn't recognize. The memo said, "Moving help / supplies." He had already paid. He had already moved money from our joint account to fund the move before he told me it was happening. I set my phone face down on the nightstand. I stared at the ceiling for a long time. In the morning, he was already in the garage when I came downstairs. I didn't go out there. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and opened my laptop and did something I'd been turning over in the back of my mind since somewhere around 3 in the morning. I searched for family law attorneys in Dallas. I wasn't ready to say the word. I wasn't even sure what I was looking for. But I had a college friend named Pryor who had become a family law attorney in Austin. And before I could overthink it, I was typing her name into my contacts and pressing call. She answered on the second ring. I said, "I think I need to understand what my rights are. In my house. In my accounts." She listened. She asked a few questions. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Mara, what you're describing is a pattern, not a single incident. I want you to think about that. Can you come to Austin this week?" I told her I would figure it out. I spent the next 3 days going through the motions. I smiled at work because the promotion was real, and I had worked for it, and I was not going to let it be swallowed by the thing happening at home. My father-in-law arrived Saturday morning in a truck that needed a new exhaust system and a lot of prayer. Terence arrived 2 hours later in an Uber because the truck hadn't had room for all their things. They moved into my house with the confidence of people who had been invited. My father-in-law sat down in my favourite chair in the living room that afternoon and asked me what was for dinner. I looked at my husband. He looked at the floor. I ordered pizza. I ate 2 slices in my bedroom and read a library book until 11. No one knocked on my door. That week was its own kind of quiet war. My father-in-law treated the house like a hotel he had chosen, but did not particularly like. He left dishes in the sink. He used the guest bathroom and left towels on the floor. Terence slept until noon, asked me twice if he could borrow my car, and had 3 loud phone conversations in the kitchen while I was trying to take work calls from the dining room table I had been relocated to. My husband acted like everything was fine. Like this was just what family did. I drove to Austin on a Friday evening after work and sat in Priya's home office with a glass of water I was too wound up to drink, and I told her everything from the beginning. She took notes. She asked about the $2,000 transfer. She asked whether my name was on the deed of the house. I said yes. We had bought it together, both names on the mortgage. She asked me how much I had contributed to the down payment. I told her I had put in 60% because I'd had savings from before we got married and he hadn't. She looked at her notepad for a moment. Then she looked at me. She said, "What happened to those savings?" I thought about it. There was the truck loan we'd never been paid back for. There was the time his brother needed help with first and last month's rent. There was the year his dad had medical bills and we'd covered a portion. I said, "I think I know where they went." She closed the notepad. She said, "I think you should open an account in your name only at a bank where you don't currently have any accounts. Move your direct deposit there, starting with your next paycheck. Don't close the joint account. Don't do anything dramatic. Just start building something that is yours. And document everything." I asked her what everything meant. "The transfer," she said. "Text where he tells you about his family moving in. Any conversations you can write down in a log with dates and times. Photos of your living situation, your relocated office. Anything that shows how your life has been disrupted without your agreement. The loan history if you have it. Keep it all in one place." I drove home in the dark feeling something I hadn't expected. Not fear. Something closer to calm. The kind of calm that comes when you realize you've already been living through the hard part and you just didn't have a name for it yet. 2 weeks after the move-in, a Saturday afternoon, I came home from a run to find my father-in-law's truck in the driveway and Terence on the front porch on his phone. I went inside. My husband was at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and a calculator. He looked up when I came in. "Sit down for a second," he said. "I got a glass of water." I sat. He said he'd been running the numbers. He said, with my new salary and their 2 incomes, if we managed things right, we could pay the house off in 8 years instead of 23. He used the word "we" a lot. He had written a budget on the legal pad. I looked at the numbers. His column had his monthly take from the auto parts store where he'd been working for 4 years. My column had my new salary. The budget assigned me 90% of the mortgage, groceries, utilities. His income was listed under household discretionary, which I took to mean his money was for whatever he wanted. "This doesn't include anything for my savings," I said. "We'll build that back up once the house is paid off," he said. "That's 8 years from now. It's an investment in our future." He used the phrase with a kind of brightness that made me feel like I was supposed to be grateful for it. I looked at the budget again. I asked, "What about my IRA contributions? I've been putting in $600 a month." He hesitated. He said we might need to pause that for now, just for a year or 2. I thought of Priya. I thought about what she had told me. Document everything. I asked him if I could keep a copy of the budget. He said sure. I took a picture of it with my phone while he was looking at his calculator. A week later, I was at the office when he called. He didn't often call during work hours. His voice was controlled in the careful way that told me he was performing. He said he'd been thinking, and we should really talk about the house, about our future, about consolidating things to make sure we were protected. He said a friend of his had suggested something called a quitclaim deed. I had looked it up already. At 2 in the morning, after a conversation with Priya where she told me to be alert for exactly this kind of language, I asked him to explain what he meant. He said it was simple. For estate planning purposes, to avoid probate, he thought I should sign my interest in the house over to him. Just temporarily. He'd add me back on the deed later. It was cleaner, he said. Easier. I did not say anything for a long moment. I said, "I'll think about it." That evening, I called Priya. I described the conversation word for word, the way she had told me to. She was very quiet when I finished. Then she said, "That's not estate planning, that's attempted theft. And now you have it on record." She told me the next step. I said okay. I was ready. My husband came home that night to a house that looked exactly the same. Dinner was on the table. His father watched the news in the living room. Terence was somewhere in the back of the house. I smiled when he came in. I asked about his day. 3 days later, a process server showed up at the auto parts store where he worked. I know this because he called me 9 times in 40 minutes that afternoon. I was in a meeting. I watched my phone light up on the edge of the conference table and I turned it face down and kept my attention on the spreadsheet my team was reviewing. When I called him back 2 hours later, I had already changed my direct deposit, opened a new checking account at a credit union across town, and taken screenshots of every significant text message we'd exchanged in the past 6 months. He was loud on the phone. He used words he had never used with me before. He said I had humiliated him. He said I had blindsided him. He said he couldn't believe after everything I was doing this to him, to his family, to us. I said all communication about the marriage and the house needs to go through my attorney. Her name and number are on the filing. He said he wasn't going to talk to some attorney. I said, that's your choice. Have a good evening. I hung up and sat in my parked car in the credit union parking lot and let myself shake for about 90 seconds. Then I started the car and drove to pick up dinner. Priya was not licensed in Texas, but she had connected me to a Dallas family law attorney named Gwendolyn Marsh, who had a corner office and a bookshelf that took up the entire south wall and an expression that suggested she had heard everything and was bored by nothing. I sat across from her desk and laid out the whole story. The move-in, the $2,000 transfer, the budget, the quitclaim request, the recording I had made of that phone call from my car, Texas being a one-party consent state. She read through the documentation I'd brought. She set it down. She said, "What you have here is a pattern of financial coercion, the transfer of marital funds without consent, the attempt to extract your equity interest through a fraudulent conveyance, the unilateral increase of household financial burden. These are not misunderstandings. These are causes of action." She told me what she was going to file for: temporary, exclusive possession of the house, based on the environment that had been created without my consent and my documented financial majority stake. Contribution to attorney's fees. Forensic accounting of all transfers from joint accounts over the past 3 years, which would include the truck loan, the rent payments, all of it. I asked her about the quitclaim request specifically. She smiled. It was a small, controlled smile. She said, "That recording is the best thing you've given me. That's your husband on tape asking you to sign away your equitable interest in a property you paid for, while you're also funding the mortgage. A judge will understand exactly what that is." I asked her what I should do in the meantime. She said, "Live your life. Do your job. Be the calm one. Let him make noise. Noise is evidence." He made a lot of noise. He showed up at my office building 2 days after he was served. I was in the middle of a call with a portfolio manager in Chicago when my work phone buzzed with a text from the front desk. She said there was a man in the lobby asking for me and he was not being cooperative with security. I finished my sentence on the call. I told my colleague I needed to step away for 2 minutes. I texted the front desk, "Do not let him up. Contact building security and give them the reference number for the protective order. It's on file with HR." I had given HR that reference number the morning after I'd filed. I sat at my desk and watched the time and kept breathing. 15 minutes later, another text. "Situation resolved." He left the building. CPD was called as a precaution. I texted back, "Thank you. Please log it." I went back to my call. That evening, his father knocked on my office door. I was back at home, working from the dining room table, which I had made into something functional with a monitor stand and a cable organizer. His father stood in the doorway and looked at me for a moment without saying anything. Then he said he thought I was making a mistake. He said my husband was a good man who was only trying to take care of his family. He said women these days didn't understand what a marriage was supposed to look like. I saved that conversation to a new folder in my notes app. I labeled it Context. 2 weeks later, we were in front of a judge for the temporary orders hearing. I sat at the petitioner's table in a slate grey blazer I had bought specifically for this day. Gwendolyn was beside me with 3 tabbed binders. On the other side of the aisle, my husband sat with his attorney, a man who appeared to have a website featuring clip art of the scales of justice. The judge was a woman in her 50s named the Honourable Patricia Waverley. She had very short silver hair and the expression of someone who had not been surprised in at least a decade. Gwendolyn presented the documentation, the deed showing my 60% contribution to the down payment, the mortgage payment history, which showed my salary had covered 72% of payments over the life of the loan, the bank records showing the $2,000 transfer, the loan history showing the $3,000 for the truck, the rent payments, the medical bills. Then she played the recording. My husband's voice came through the small speaker on Gwendolyn's laptop, clearly enough that I could see the judge's expression change when he said the word quitclaim. The other attorney objected on the grounds of relevance. The judge said, "I find it very relevant." She said it without looking at him. My husband's attorney made the argument that I had abandoned the marital home by choosing to spend 2 nights a week at my friend's guest room after the move-in. He said I was the higher earner and had no need for support. He said the protective order was an overreaction. The judge looked at him for a moment after he sat down. She asked whether his client was aware that moving 2 additional adults into the marital residence without the co-owner's consent and then attempting to obtain that co-owner's equity interest through a quitclaim request was not generally considered the behavior of someone acting in good faith. The attorney said it was a miscommunication. The judge said, "That's one word for it." She granted temporary exclusive use of the house to me. She ordered my husband to cover 100% of the mortgage until further order. She granted a contribution to my attorney's fees. She denied his request to have me removed from the property. She told his attorney that a person being driven out of her own home by circumstances her co-owner created was not abandonment. My husband stood up when she finished and said her name loudly. The bailiff stepped forward. Gwendolyn put her hand flat on the table in front of her. A signal I'd learned meant, do not respond, do not move, do not give them anything. I sat still. I watched my husband be escorted back to his chair. I watched his father, who was sitting in the gallery, put his face in his hands. I picked up my bag and followed Gwendolyn out of the courtroom. In the marble hallway, she told me we'd won this round. She said the quitclaim recording had done what she thought it would do. She said we now had leverage for the final settlement. I said, "What does that look like?" She said, "He can't afford the mortgage alone. His father and brother certainly can't contribute enough. The house goes on the market, the proceeds are divided based on documented financial contribution, and you walk away with significantly more than half. He'll resist, and then he'll realize he has no better options." She was right. The resistance lasted about 3 weeks, during which time he sent me 14 text messages through his attorney in various tones ranging from conciliatory to threatening. His father called my mother and said things I will not repeat. And Terence left a voicemail on my personal number that I saved and sent to Gwendolyn without listening to it twice. Then the mortgage company sent the first late notice. After that, things moved quickly. The settlement was reached on a Tuesday morning. He got 38% of the net proceeds from the house sale. I got 62%. He paid a portion of my legal fees as ordered. There was a non-disparagement clause that went both ways, which his attorney had tried to remove, and Gwendolyn had refused to allow. He signed on a Thursday. I signed an hour later from the lobby of my office building during a break between meetings. The house closed 6 weeks after that. My share came through on a Wednesday afternoon. I was at my desk when I got the notification from the credit union. I looked at the number for a moment. Then I closed the notification and went back to the analysis I was working on because there was a client call in 20 minutes and the numbers needed to be right. That evening I drove to a neighbourhood in Uptown I'd had my eye on for a year, to a 1-bedroom apartment on the 9th floor with south-facing windows and a small balcony where I'd already decided I was going to put a container garden. The leasing agent handed me the keys and told me the move-in date, and I stood in the empty living room for a few minutes, looking at the Dallas skyline through the window. It was mine. Not ours. Mine. I started the container garden on a Sunday in March. Tomatoes and basil and one rosemary plant that the woman at the nursery told me was nearly impossible to kill, which I appreciated as a selling point. Priya came to visit that same weekend. We drank wine on the balcony in the late afternoon light, and she asked me how I was doing, and I thought about it genuinely before I answered. I said, "I think I'm good. I think I actually am." She looked at me. She said she believed me. She said she believed me. Work had changed too, in the way things change when you stop spending energy managing around a problem that isn't yours to solve. I had my team of 3 now, 2 analysts and a coordinator, and we had just finished a project that Denise had presented at the quarterly partner meeting as a model for how the firm should be approaching mid-market clients. My name was in the slide deck. A few months after the closing, I got a text from a number I didn't recognize. It was him. He'd gotten a new phone. He said he'd made a mistake. He said he was sorry. He said he hadn't understood what he'd had and that everything had fallen apart and his father and his brother were fighting and he was barely covering rent on the apartment he'd moved into and he missed me and the house and the life we'd built. I read it once. Then I blocked the number. Not because I was still angry. I wasn't, mostly, but because I had learned something in the past year that no one had ever said to me directly, which was that an apology that comes after consequences is not the same as accountability, it's just pain looking for somewhere to put itself. And I had already decided I was not that place anymore. Priya asked me once, a few months later, if I ever thought about whether things could have been different, whether I could have said something sooner, pushed back harder, made him understand earlier. I thought about it. I said, maybe, but I also don't think he would have heard it until it was too late. Some people only understand a thing when it's already gone. She nodded. She said that was probably true. I have a savings account now that I add to every month without interruption. I have an IRA contribution set up on automatic deposit. I have a will that I updated last year with an estate planning attorney who was thorough and slightly terrifying in exactly what I needed. I have a circle of friends and colleagues who know my name and what I do and who do not refer to me as the wife. I have a balcony full of plants. The rosemary is thriving. Last spring, I was asked to speak at a professional women's lunch in Dallas, one of those events where someone gives a 20-minute talk about their career and then everyone has chicken and networking. I almost said no. Then I said yes. I stood at the podium and told a version of the story that was still true but shorter. And when I got to the part about sitting in my car in a parking lot deciding to make a call that would change everything, I looked out of the room and I said, the hardest part wasn't the legal process. The hardest part was believing I was allowed to take up space in my own house, in my own finances, in my own life. A woman in the third row started crying. She looked about my age, or maybe a little younger. She was trying not to let it show and not quite succeeding. I looked at her and I finished my sentence and I kept going because the story was not about the hard part. It was about what was on the other side of it. I'm still here. The view from the ninth floor is very good.